China and the Philippines are blaming each other for weekend confrontations in the South China Sea that rate among the most damaging encounters in recent times. The country's coast guards clashed twice in disputed waters.
The South China Sea is getting heated again, and this time, the Indo-Pacific region has found a new mighty alliance in the Philippines and the U.S. China's presence in the South China Sea is a force to be reckoned with. Despite the violation of international law, Beijing has continued to treat the sea as its own territory. And well, the Philippines is gearing up for a U.S.-backed military response. Join us as we break down the landmark ruling on the South China Sea, the emerging Filipino-American alliance, and the shift in the Filipino perception of the U.S. China's new national map is the Philippines' biggest nightmare. The map features a newly pronounced 9-dash line that claims the most heated territory in Asia, the South China Sea. Let's give you a bit of context. China's 9-dash policy is the only reason why it claims the entirety of the sea. These lines or segments were drawn by a Chinese geographer in the 1940s. These segments indicate the history of Chinese ownership of the sea, or that's what at least China seems to believe. So, technically, the crux of this heated crisis is imaginary dotted segments. The problem is that these segments are also discontinuous, but somehow for China, this is their national boundary on the sea. It's no surprise that China's claims have created a geopolitical crisis. The 9-dash line made its way to the Chinese maps in 1947. Ever since, countries like the US, Australia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and others have rejected China's claims. But there's one country that has a legal victory over their counterclaims, and that's the Philippines. Back in 2013, the Philippines had instituted arbitral proceedings against China. The country was largely concerned with Beijing's increasing maritime entitlements at sea. In particular, the Filipino fishermen were losing territory to carry out their operations. China refused to cooperate. It rejected the claims, and for a large part didn't participate in the proceedings. But The Hague didn't see that as an obstacle. In 2016, it awarded the Philippines a decisive victory over their claims. The tribunal couldn't exactly solve the territorial issues. This meant that it was unclear who owned the maritime features in the sea. For instance, both parties have claimed the Spratly Islands, yet the tribunal didn't decide on the island's ownership or didn't draw the maritime boundary. What it did was to award the Philippines the decision over 3 grounds. First, the tribunal questioned China's historical claims on the sea. The jury decided that Beijing couldn't exercise its power in the coastal states. This is because the Law of the Sea Convention, or UNCLOS, doesn't recognize prehistoric rights. Secondly, the Philippines had called out China's massive constructions on the sea. These installations were altering the maritime features to produce economic output. Beijing had carried out massive plans to use the sea for militarization as well. The jury called these advancements illegal. Technically, China was secretly turning low-tide elevations into coastal states. These states would have been the country's exclusive economic zones, or EEZ. This had redefined the Philippine sea border. The Hague found China's activities to be illegal once again. Lastly, the issue came down to Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal. This is the issue that had riled up the Filipino community against China to no end. You see, China was illegally using the Filipino territory for its fishermen. The EEZ under the Philippines became an important question. The issue was about the Chinese fishermen and vessels that had entered the territory as if it were their own. The tribunal had called Chinese activities in the Philippine territory questionable. This is the rundown of the 3 issues recognized by the jury. All 3 had pro-Philippines rulings at the end. China refused to accept this decision. It called the awards null and void. To this date, China doesn't recognize the legality of the award. Remember the national map that we talked about at the beginning of this video? Well, that's in direct violation of international law. So far, China hasn't yielded to the Philippines' landmark victory. It continues to militarize the South China Sea to protect its territorial claims. Experts have called these measures an extension of Chinese exceptionalism. Beijing has a stark belief that it's above international law, and that's why the Philippines is taking a different route to counter Beijing in the sea. It's now resorted to a pro-US military stance after years of disengagement. Enjoying the video so far? Why don't you go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Perhaps it was a balancing act, but President Duterte valued China as a trading partner during his tenure. It didn't matter to him that China was militarizing its territory, or the fact that Filipino fishermen are losing businesses every single day. For him, these small islands couldn't hinder China's overall economic power. He continued to enter into agreements with Beijing. During the same time, China exponentially increased its military presence in the sea. Marcos Jr., who took the reins of the Philippines in 2022, has a bit of a different approach. He believes that the situation in the South China Sea has become more dire for his nation, and he's taken a friendly approach with the U.S. More specifically, he's shown a keen interest in extracting protectionist incentives from NATO. On February 2, 2023, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin III announced something monumental. For the first time in 30 years, U.S. troops were making their way to the Philippines. These troops occupied 4 new military bases in the country and were expected to organize joint military training and camps with the Filipino contingent. Today, the U.S. has a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. This is important for 2 reasons. Marcos Jr. has designed a new foreign policy with the U.S. that had previously deteriorated under Duterte. Secondly, the U.S. was in search of a strategic partner to counter China's growing influence in the Strait of Malacca and beyond. Let's just say this match was made in heaven. Marcos Jr. had always felt that the U.S. could have done more to counter China. The moment came in October 2023, when 2 Chinese vessels collided with the Filipino boats at Second Thomas Shoal. The Filipino boats were on their way to resupply the personnel at the shoal when the incident happened. China alleged that the Filipino boats were at fault, yet Marcos' administration announced the opposite. In this regard, the U.S. was at the forefront of the issue. Biden's office warned that it can take joint action against the Chinese aggression in the sea. This was the exact hand of support that Marcos Jr. had hoped for. Similarly, the U.S. and the Philippines are working closely on all fronts. Military cooperation is multifaceted. Other than joining naval forces, the countries are making weapons agreements too. And for the first time in 3 decades, Filipino citizens are welcoming U.S. presence in their country. So what is the perception of the public? The American-Filipino alliance has a bleak history. Until 1992, the U.S. had used the Philippines as a colony and a military outpost. The foreign, imperial presence of the U.S. is a dark page in the history of the Philippines. When the U.S. finally left the country in 1992, their departure was met with celebration and a victory. So it's a given that the Filipinos have seen the American alliance with their country with skepticism. But of course, everything changed with China's presence in the South China Sea. Many Filipinos felt like Duterte hadn't done enough to strong-arm Beijing since the 2016 ruling. His friendly relations with China had caused a major economic blow to the Filipinos who relied on the sea to earn a wage. They knew that the sea was no longer safe, and the most fruitful fishing zones were being patrolled by the Chinese military. Plus, Chinese buildings have caused significant damage to the sea. China has been pumping sediment from the seafloor to form new islands in the Philippine territory. These efforts have blocked Filipino vessels from accessing the fishing zones. In September 2023, the Philippine Coast Guard caught a Chinese floating barrier under the Scarborough Shoal. The issue caused anger and concern in the country. The barrier was life-threatening to the Filipino fishermen who were accustomed to taking the route. Their vessels risked collapse. Even worse, they could have gotten trapped in the barrier. Immediately, there was a rise of anti-China sentiment in the country. When Marcos Jr. undertook active efforts to regain lost islands like the Spratly Reef, he was applauded dearly. But the Filipinos also know that the U.S. is their key to counter China in the Indo-Pacific region. The process is gradual, but slowly, the Filipino population is accepting Marcos Jr.'s pro-U.S. foreign policy. For the country, this is the only viable option to counter the Chinese threat of invasion. They've tried the legal route, and that didn't work. Today, the U.S.-Philippines alliance is pivotal for Filipino sovereignty, and the public perception of the issue is leaning towards a pro-U.S. sentiment. The times have now changed. This isn't 1992 anymore. Did you find this video interesting? Give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and make sure to watch more of our videos.